On March 26, 1997, sheriff's deputies in San Diego County walked up the driveway of a rented mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, California, expecting, at most, a welfare check. The place looked like the kind of home you'd see in a real estate brochure: manicured lawn, big windows, a quiet cul-de-sac lined with trees. Neighbors knew it as the house with the computer people, a group that mostly kept to themselves but paid their rent on time, jogged in the mornings, and drove a few nondescript cars. What the deputies found inside would turn that house into one of the most infamous addresses in American true crime. They stepped through the front door and hit a wall of chemical smell. The air was cold, the air conditioning had been cranked up. The blinds were drawn. It took a moment for their eyes to adjust to the dim. Then they saw the bodies, 39 of them in all. Adults, lying neatly on their backs in bunk beds and on mattresses, feet toward the door, arms at their sides. They were dressed identically: black shirts, black sweatpants, brand new black and white Nike sneakers. Each body had a purple cloth carefully draped over the upper face and chest. Nearby, on nightstands and shelves, were small duffel bags and neatly folded belongings. No overturned furniture. No signs of a struggle. Just rows of people who, from all appearances, had calmly laid down as if to sleep. On a few, the purple shrouds had slipped just enough for deputies to see plastic bags around their heads. There were also patches on some of their clothing, little emblems that looked like something from a sci-fi convention. They said, "Heaven's Gate Away Team." Within hours, the news was everywhere. 39 members of a UFO cult had killed themselves in an upscale suburb of San Diego, apparently believing that they were about to be picked up by a spaceship hiding behind a comet streaking through the sky. For most people, Heaven's Gate seemed to come out of nowhere, a bizarre flash on the nightly news, a punchline about Nikes, and catching a ride on a comet. But for the people inside that house, this ending was decades in the making. And to understand how they got there, how intelligent, often highly educated, sometimes middle-aged adults ended up willing, even eager, to die for a promised spacecraft, you have to go back to the early 1970s, before the purple cloths and the headlines. Back to a music teacher and a nurse who decided they were prophets. Marshall Applewhite grew up in Texas, the son of a Presbyterian minister. He taught music at a college, directed choirs, and had what students described as a charismatic presence: intense, expressive, with a booming voice. Underneath, by most accounts, he was struggling with his mental health, with his sexuality in a time and culture that did not make that easy, and with a sense that his life didn't quite fit the mold he'd been handed. In 1972, in a Houston hospital where he was dealing with emotional problems, he met Bonnie Nettles, a nurse in her mid-40s with a deep interest in astrology, New Age spirituality, and the more mystical bits of the Bible. She was married with kids, but spiritually restless. He was spiritually restless and unmoored. Together, they found something in each other that clicked. They pored over the book of Revelation, science fiction, and UFO lore. They talked about reincarnation and higher beings. They went to channelers and psychics. At some point, they came to believe that they weren't just students of this stuff. They thought they were the main characters. They decided that they were the two mentioned in Revelation, witnesses sent by a higher, extraterrestrial intelligence to prepare a select group of humans to ascend to a next level beyond Earth. The names would change over the years, but the roles stayed the same. Bonnie became T. Marshall became Do. Like the musical notes, the leaders of the class. In 1973, they left their old lives behind, jobs, families, everything, and hit the road. If you lived on the West Coast or in the Southwest in the mid-70s, you might have seen their posters. Plain, black and white handbills on telephone poles and community bulletin boards, with headlines like, "UFOs, why they are here, who they have come for. 2 individuals say they will be leaving this Earth in a spacecraft. Will you join them?" They rented cheap meeting rooms in libraries, churches, and college student unions. People would come in expecting a UFO lecture or a New Age workshop and find 2 very serious, very plain-looking people sitting at a table, telling them that the Bible's promises about being caught up in the clouds weren't about angels and harps, they were about spacecraft. T did most of the early talking. Do watched, then added commentary in his slow, measured Texas drawl. Their basic pitch went like this: Earth was about to be spaded under and recycled. Humanity as a whole had failed to live up to its spiritual potential. But a small group of souls, those who overcame their human attachments, could graduate into the next level, becoming evergreen, genderless beings who lived beyond the constraints of Earth in physical spacecraft. This wasn't some floaty, disembodied heaven. They talked about next-level vehicles instead of bodies, crafts instead of clouds. It was part Star Trek, part Revelation, part 1970s self-help. For a certain kind of seeker, it was electrifying. The 1970s were full of spiritual explorers, people disillusioned by Vietnam, Watergate, and the 9-to-5 grind. People who had tried mainstream religion and found it wanting. People who'd experimented with drugs, therapy, meditation, and still felt like something was missing. T and Do offered clarity and urgency, a story where all the weirdness of the times made sense. Eventually, they told their listeners, a spacecraft would land and physically pick them up. In one of their biggest recruitment pushes, in 1975, they held a meeting in Waldport, Oregon, that drew national attention. Dozens of people, after hearing them speak, literally packed up their lives, sold belongings, quit jobs, left families, and disappeared, joining the class as it crisscrossed the country. Newspapers ran stories about people vanishing with a UFO cult. If you'd met a Heaven's Gate member in those early days, you might not have thought cult right away. They were idealistic, often anti-materialist, talking about leaving behind greed, selfishness, and the ego-driven culture of Earth. Many had college degrees. Some were computer programmers, nurses, artists, or small business owners. A significant number were middle-aged, not impressionable teens, people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, who had already lived a chunk of life and still felt like there had to be something more. The group lived simply, often camping or staying in cheap motels. They gave up sex, drugs, and alcohol. They followed a strict regimen, eating bland food and wearing androgynous clothing. Leaders asked them to abandon their human names and adopt new ones that ended with Odie, a linguistic reminder that they were no longer just somebody, but a child of T and Do. On the surface, the rules looked like discipline. Underneath, they were also about control. No sex, no family contact, shared bank accounts, shared housing, shared schedules. No last names, no personal identity. Old photos packed away. Old lives referred to as past incarnations. Old relationships described as attachments. In psychology, we call this identity stripping. If you want someone to see themselves only through the lens of your group, you gradually disconnect them from every other lens they have. For Heaven's Gate, the justification was always the same. You were overcoming the human in order to be ready when the spacecraft arrived. At first, T and Do believed that the next level would take them, with their bodies, off-planet. Then reality intruded. In 1985, Bonnie Nettles, T, the co-leader who had been the spiritual engine of the group, died of cancer. Her body didn't ascend. There was no spaceship hovering above the hospital room. She died like any other human being, in pain, in a bed, from a disease. For a group that said next-level members had overcome disease and death, this was a theological earthquake. Marshall Applewhite could have taken it as a sign that the whole thing was wrong. Instead, he did what authoritarian leaders almost always do when prophecy collides with reality. He reinterpreted. T hadn't failed, he said. She had simply gone ahead of them, exiting her vehicle and returning to the next level. Her body dying was like a suit being unzipped and dropped on the floor. From then on, the group's doctrine shifted. If the next level could take T without a spaceship landing, maybe the rest of them wouldn't leave bodily, either. Maybe they too would have to exit their vehicles at some point. In the years that followed, the group shrank in numbers but deepened in commitment. They rented houses, living quietly in suburban neighborhoods under assumed names. They ran legitimate businesses, most notably a web design and computer services company in the 1990s called Higher Source. They were good at it. Their clients saw only clean code and polite texts. Inside the group, life became even more controlled. They lived by detailed checklists: how to fold clothes, how to wash dishes, how to address one another. They all wore similar, gender-neutral clothing and the same short pageboy haircuts. They watched old episodes of Star Trek and sci-fi movies, not as entertainment, but as partial truths seeded by the next level. Sex, already banned, was treated as an almost radioactive danger. Several male members, including Applewhite himself, eventually underwent surgical castration, traveling to Mexico when they couldn't find a surgeon in the U.S. willing to perform the procedure. They framed it as liberation from the pull of mammalian urges. From the outside, all of this sounds extreme. From the inside, it was a slow boil. Nobody joined Heaven's Gate thinking, I'd like to give up my name, my family, my sexuality, and eventually my life for a comet. They joined thinking, I'm leaving behind a broken world for a higher purpose. The rules, the isolation, the redefinitions of language, all that came step by step over years. By the mid-1990s, Applewhite, now in his 60s, started speaking more openly about a deadline. He and a small core of members put together a website, heavensgate.com, one of the earliest examples of a religious group using the internet to recruit. The site was a strange mix: 90s web design, gray backgrounds, blue links, amateur graphics, and dense, earnest text about the next level, away teams, and the urgent need to leave Earth before it was recycled. They held a few public meetings again, but the heyday of recruiting was past. Most people who heard them in 1994 or 1995 walked away thinking they were just another odd New Age sect. Then, in 1996, the sky gave them a sign. Astronomers had discovered a bright new comet, Hale-Bopp, that would be visible to the naked eye for months as it swept past Earth in early 1997. It became a media sensation: gorgeous photos in magazines, nightly updates on the news, backyard telescopes aimed up by the millions. Around the same time, an amateur astronomer claimed to have photographed a mysterious object following behind Hale-Bopp, a companion that some UFO enthusiasts seized on as evidence of an alien craft. That claim was quickly debunked by scientists, but in the world of late-night radio and fringe newsletters, the idea stuck. Maybe there was something behind the comet. For Marshall Applewhite, this was confirmation. Here was a bright, undeniable sign in the sky, on every TV, in every newspaper, a once-in-a-lifetime visitor, with rumors of a companion object that mainstream authorities were dismissing. He told his followers that the next level had sent a craft behind Hale-Bopp to pick them up. Earth was about to be wiped clean. Their window was closing. If they wanted to board the craft, they would have to leave their human vehicles behind. Suicide, he said, wasn't what they were doing. Suicide, in his redefined language, was staying on Earth when you knew the truth, that this planet was about to be recycled. Leaving your body at the right moment, in the right way, under his guidance, wasn't self-destruction. It was, in his words, graduation. By early 1997, the group had settled into that rented mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, an expensive but anonymous base for the higher source business and their final preparations. Neighbors saw polite, quiet people who kept to themselves, jogged, and occasionally went on group outings for pizza. Inside, the members were recording exit videos. In those tapes, which you can still find today, one after another sits in front of a camera, smiling, explaining why they're excited to leave. They talk about how long they've been in the class, 20 years, 15 years, since the 70s. They talk about the next level, as calmly as you might talk about a new job in another state. They use phrases like, I'm so happy and I can't wait. If you didn't know what you were watching, you might think it was a video yearbook. It's one of the most chilling artifacts to come out of any cult. Ordinary-looking people, in ordinary 90s sweaters, talking about their planned deaths with the upbeat tone of someone announcing a promotion. What you don't see in those tapes is the years of psychological conditioning that got them there. There's something else. Almost all of them had cut ties with their families. Some had written final letters, framing their departure as an act of joy and destiny. Some hadn't written at all. For many, the group was the only community they had left. Leaving Heaven's Gate at that point would have meant being alone in a world they'd been taught to see as corrupt, doomed, and full of hostile humans. Believing in the Comet ship wasn't just about doctrine. It was about belonging. In late March 1997, as Hale-Bopp shone bright in the night sky, Heaven's Gate put their plan into motion. The basic method was clinical. They mixed phenobarbital, a sedative, into applesauce or pudding, chased it with vodka, then placed plastic bags over their heads to ensure they would stop breathing as they lost consciousness. They wore the black outfits and Nike sneakers like a uniform, like a team jersey for their away mission. They did it in waves over several days. First, a group would take the mixture and lie down on their beds, purple cloths folded nearby. Others would help them secure the plastic bags, then monitor until they were dead. Once they were sure, the helpers would remove the bags, arrange the bodies neatly, and place the purple shrouds over the upper torso and face. Then, another group would repeat the process. Eventually, only a handful were left, the ones who would take the final dose without anyone there to tidy things up. That's why a few bodies were found without the purple covering or with plastic bags still in place. There was no one left to remove them. Before they started, They mailed FedEx packages to former members and a few media outlets. Letters, copies of their exit videos, final statements explaining that they had exited their vehicles voluntarily to board a craft behind Hale-Bopp. One of those former members, a man they called Rio, received his package, watched the tapes, and realized what must have happened. He went to the house in Rancho Santa Fe, found the bodies, and placed the first frantic call to authorities. From there, the scene became a circus. Helicopters hovered over the mansion. Live trucks filled the street. Reporters described, in hushed tones, the rows of bodies, the identical shoes, the purple shrouds. The cultural shorthand formed almost immediately. Nikes. Kool-Aid. Comet. Spaceship. It's easy from a distance to see Heaven's Gate as absurd, a bunch of people in weird clothes, brainwashed into dropping everything for a sci-fi fantasy. It's harder, but more honest, to recognize how their story overlaps with very ordinary human vulnerabilities. Many of them were joiners by nature, people who had spent their lives looking for community and higher purpose. Some had already been through other spiritual movements in the 60s and 70s. Some were gay or lesbian, trying to navigate identity in a time and culture that made that painful. Some were aging, watching their bodies deteriorate, and found comfort in the idea of a new, perfected vehicle. They didn't join a suicide cult. They joined a spiritual community that promised cosmic meaning and asked for sacrifice in return. The sacrifices got bigger over time. The rest of the world got farther away. By the time Marshall Applewhite looked into a camera and told them it was time to graduate, the idea of saying no wasn't just scary. For many of them, it felt like betraying the only family they had left. That doesn't erase their agency. Grown adults made a decision that ended their lives. It does complicate the narrative that they were simply stupid or crazy. Psychologically, Heaven's Gate is a case study in how groupthink, charismatic authority, and gradual isolation can make almost any belief, no matter how strange, feel like absolute truth inside a closed circle. The leader redefines language so that words like suicide mean the opposite of their usual meaning. The group rehearses loyalty with smaller tests, like giving up sex or speaking to family. Outsiders are framed as enemies or lower beings who just don't get it. Doubts are recast as mind games sent by negative forces. Once you've given 20 years of your life to something and cut off everyone who doesn't believe it, walking away means facing not just the possibility that you were wrong, but that you've wasted decades and hurt people you love. Going forward, staying in the story can feel perversely easier. Heaven's Gate also sits in an odd place in American religious history. It was in its own way very American, individualistic, innovative, drawing freely from evangelical Christianity, New Age spirituality, and science fiction. It used the latest technology, web design, email, early internet marketing, to spread its message. It spoke the language of personal choice and upgrading yourself to a new level. At the same time, it was a tiny, closed group that most Americans only thought about when the bodies hit the news. After the suicides, a few former members remained true believers. They still maintain the Heaven's Gate website as a kind of digital tombstone and contact point. They didn't die with the others for various reasons, illness, family obligations, personal doubts, but they still see T and do as messengers from a higher level. For the families of those who did die, the grief has been complicated. Some had been estranged for years, sending letters back and forth with children or siblings who insisted they were happier than ever in the group. Others had never stopped hoping their loved one would come home someday. Instead, they got a phone call from a coroner or saw a face they recognized in a news photo. For them, the Nike jokes and the Comet memes weren't clever. They were salt in a wound. Watching those exit videos today, you're struck by how ordinary the members look. They talk about going grocery shopping, about living together, about everyday chores. They laugh. They tease each other. They describe their impending deaths with the same tone someone might use to talk about an upcoming long road trip. If you or I had met them in a coffee shop and not heard the theology, we might have walked away thinking, nice, if a little intense. That's part of what makes this story unsettling, because it pokes at a fear most of us have but don't like to admit, that our sense of reality is, to some extent, socially constructed. Believe something wild alone, and people call you delusional. Believe it surrounded by a tight community that reinforces it, and it becomes common sense within that group. We all live inside some version of that, political tribes, religious communities, fandoms, online subcultures. Heaven's Gate is what happens when that tendency is combined with a leader whose mental illness and charisma go unchecked, a worldview that sees death as transformation, and a moment in time when a bright comet in the sky can be read as a cosmic green light. Tonight, if you happen to look up and see a bright point of light, a planet, a star, a passing satellite, you'll probably think of scientific explanations, orbital dynamics, reflected sunlight, astrophysics. Somewhere inside the memory of modern America, though, there's a little corner that remembers otherwise. It remembers the purple cloths, the bunk beds, the away team patches, the note that said they had exited their vehicles. It remembers Heaven's Gate, the cult that waited for a comet, and the very human desire underneath it all. To believe that we're meant for more than this. To believe that someone somewhere has a plan to take us there. And the danger, always, of trusting that promise more than we trust our own instinct to keep living on the ground.